So if the body has the ability to use both glucose and fat for fuel, why do we make ketones? I find this mechanism extremely interesting, and it can actually give you insight as to what's currently happening inside your physiology. So I think the first thing that's important to know is that the brain actually can't use fats for fuel. This is because there's a barrier inside of the brain called the blood-brain barrier, and it only allows glucose and ketones to enter into the brain. It allows many other molecules in, but in terms of fatty acids, these actually can't enter into the brain. So when you're not in a state of ketosis, the brain only uses glucose and lactate, which is a byproduct of glucose, as an energy source, and it will only use a very, very minute percent of fatty acids as fuel. It's estimated that the brain uses between 120 and 160 grams of glucose every single day. But when we're in a state of ketosis, ketones can supply upwards of 75% of the brain's energy needs. And it really seems to be dependent on the state of ketosis we are in, meaning that the more ketones that we produce, the more energy the brain is going to derive strictly from ketones. But even at its lowest, the brain is still going to need about 25 to 40 grams of glucose every day. And not only that, there are other cells inside of our body that can only use glucose, specifically our red blood cells. And all this is just pointing out the fact that we need a certain amount of glucose every single day inside of our bloodstream. However, we don't need to ingest a single gram of glucose to get this glucose. We can go through a process called gluconeogenesis. And this process is very important. This is the process of turning things that aren't glucose, specifically the glycerol backbone of triglycerides, which are the storage form of fat, amino acids, which are what protein is made out of, and lactate, which is actually a byproduct of not fully breaking down glucose. All of these things can actually be turned back into glucose inside of our liver. And the liver is responsible for almost any important process in our body, so I think we should really be respecting our livers. And gluconeogenesis is really important to ketone production, not because it contributes to the formation of ketones, but it actually inhibits the breakdown of fat. So inside our liver, both glucose and fatty acids are broken down into a new molecule called acetyl-CoA. And there's a specific enzyme called oxaloacetate that turns this acetyl-CoA into citric acid. And citric acid is eventually turned into the energy that all of our cells use called ATP. But importantly, oxaloacetate is also used for gluconeogenesis. And this is why, in order to get into a state of ketosis, we need to drastically inhibit our glucose intake. And this will increase the amount of gluconeogenesis we go through. Consequently, we will take the oxaloacetate away from the breakdown of fatty acids. And this molecule of acetyl-CoA will build up inside of the liver. But luckily, acetyl-CoA is the thing needed to produce ketones. Through a series of steps, 2 acetyl-CoA molecules are eventually turned into a ketone. And this is why the degree of ketosis we get into is dictated by the amount of glucose we restrict. Because the more glucose we restrict, the more gluconeogenesis we'll be forced to go through, meaning less oxaloacetate available to turn this acetyl-CoA into citric acid, which means more acetyl-CoA buildup and more acetyl-CoA available for ketone production. The other use of oxaloacetate is in what's called the urea cycle. During gluconeogenesis, we'll create a kind of toxic molecule called ammonia, and the urea cycle is how the body actually neutralizes this molecule and excretes it. So as you can tell, when we're restricting our glucose, oxaloacetate simply has much more important roles than the breakdown of acetyl-CoA. Therefore, it will accumulate inside the liver, and the liver has the wonderful ability to produce ketones that can supply energy to the entire body. And interestingly, the oxaloacetate depletion only occurs in the liver. And this is important because when the ketones arrive to the target tissue, such as the brain or the muscle, these tissues actually have a supply of oxaloacetate, meaning we can break down ketones back into acetyl-CoA, and these cells have the oxaloacetate to completely metabolize it for energy. Honestly, I think the body is just really, really smart. With that being said, thank you for sticking around to the end, and I hope I have the pleasure of speaking to you next video.